Hey everybody, it's Ryan Metzler here again, and today we're going to take a look at what was an Essen release from Martin Wallace and part of his series of last year. We're going to look at Mythotopia, which is another in his line of card-driven games that take place on a map that you might compare to, for example, A Few Acres of Snow, or if you've played Ankh-Morpork. Despite not being terribly similar to this, there are some similarities that you will probably notice. This game is for anywhere between 2 and 4 players, I believe, off of the top of my head. Lasts probably at least an hour, but not too long, depending on the AP of your players. But we'll see you using a hand of cards in order to perform various actions, be it building things, sending armies out to conquer places, drafting new cards, or accomplishing other victory point goals, such as just spending money to buy victory points. So real quick, why don't we take a look at what you get inside of this box. We'll see how the game plays, then we'll come back here at the end and get my opinions on Mythotopia. So here you can see Mythotopia all set up, and we're set up for a 4-player game. Now, in this 4-player game, you'll see that each player has some towns out on the board starting. And during the setup, you're dealt some towns, some provinces, and that tells you where you're going to get your starting towns. Also, during the beginning of the game, you have some cards that are set up for improvements. These will be cards that you can add to your deck by drafting them throughout the round. We'll talk about these in a little bit. And you're also going to have some starting victory point conditions. For example, building cities will be worth victory points. Building roads will be worth victory points. Building castles will be worth victory points. And those 3 are always in the game. So it's 2, 2, and 1 points for building each of those things as long as these counters are here. Additionally, you're going to randomize some victory conditions. So currently our randomized victory conditions are the Spoils of War, which is worth 1 extra victory point if you take a province over from another player. The Defenders of the Realm, which is actually worth a victory point if you defend your territory from being taken over by another player. And then we have Lord of the Isles and Masters of the Sea. Lord of the Isles will give you 3 victory points if you manage to hold all 3 provinces on the large island, and 2 victory points if you happen to hold both of the provinces on the small island. And Master of the Sea will give you 2 victory points if you're in 3 different sea areas, and another 2 victory points if you're in 4 different sea areas. These could be different victory point conditions, depending on what we randomized at the beginning of the game. So there could be dragons on the board, there could be gilded cities where you can spend extra when you build, or roadside inns where you can spend extra when you build roads. But depending on what you draw at the beginning, the victory point conditions will be different. The same is true for the improvement cards. Now, as I said, each player in the 4-player game will start with 6 provinces. The number of provinces you'll start with will be different depending on the number of players, but those province cards will be shuffled into your deck. So each player will start with the same basic cards, a ship card, a market card, a building card, and an army card, but they'll also start with the 6 provinces that they were dealt at the beginning of the game. And these all get shuffled together. Each player also starts the game with their town tokens, some armies. They're going to start with 6 armies, 2 ship tokens, and then their reserve board, which has their cities on it that they may build throughout the game. This also dictates how many cards they may store in their reserve. Once your deck is shuffled at the start of the game, you're going to draw 5 cards. And this is a card-driven game where you're going to be using these cards to take various actions throughout the game. And there are many actions you may take using these cards. When you have your cards, on your turn you're going to take 2 actions from this list of all of the possible actions you can see here. I'm going to place this in front of myself so that I can remember what they all are, but here is a nice reference just showing you that there are a lot of choices you can make, but from turn to turn, hopefully your choices will not be that many. The different actions, I'll try and cover as many of them as possible, but note that mostly you're going to be trying to build various things on the board, bring more armies into a play, and attack other players in order to try and take over their provinces, which are worth 3 victory points apiece, plus the victory points you get over here, or to position yourself to accomplish various things, but essentially increase your victory points so that you can be the winner at the end of the game. So, the first one I'd like to talk about, because the cards in my hand facilitate it well, are I would like to build a castle. Building a castle is going to increase the defense of one of my areas. And I'm going to build it somewhere out on the board where I'm already in existence. So, for example, I might want to build a castle in Grimp. In order to build a castle in Grimp, I must have the card in which I want to build. So I'm going to build in Grimp. I also have to have a build card, and it just so happens that I have one in my hand. We'll see the build card will allow me to build a city for 2 stone, a road for 2 stone, or 3 if I want to build the road over the hills, or I can build a castle, and that will allow me to spend 1 stone in order to increase my defense. So, I have the Grimp card, which is where I want to build, and now this stone is useless for me. This card is Grimp. I have the build card, which I will be using for the action. The stone is also useless on this card, so I can't use that stone, but I have a couple of more cards in my hand. I'm going to use the stone on the Kinnabara card here, or Kinnabra card. So now I've got the place I want to build, the building card, and the stone I need to build it. And those 3 cards, when played, will allow me to build my castle out in Grimp. And now my defense in Grimp is even higher. Typically speaking, my defense is going to be the number of tokens I have there, army tokens, plus the defense of my castle, plus the defense of the terrain, making this a very hard area for yellow to potentially attack. When I'm done with that, I'm going to go and look and see if there's any victory points for castles, which there is. So I'll take my 1 victory point and add it to my supply, and I would increase my victory points by 1. Now I have 19, 3 for each of my 6 provinces, and the 1 that I just earned. That's my first action, and maybe my second action would be that I want to draft a card from these starting initial improvement cards that exist. In order to draft a card from here, I have to pay 1 gold. Each card can only be used for one thing, so if I use this for the gold, I can't use it for the brick and I can't use it for the food. But I'm going to spend this for the 1 gold, and that's going to allow me to go through this deck and choose any 1 improvement card I want and add it to my discard pile, which will again cycle back into my deck later. So I could, for example, get a Marauders card, which would be a free action, doesn't cost me one of my actions, to remove any army counter from any one province. Somebody runs by and shoots them. Or I could get a ship card, which will allow me to play ships out. Ships allow me to travel over water, and when played as a ship, for the icon, but when they're out in the water, they actually provide attack or defense to the adjacent provinces. Or I could get a warehouse, which it will increase the capacity of my reserve, which are cards that I can store from round to round. Or a philosopher that will allow me to draw 3 cards from the remaining improvements and place one of those cards to the side afterwards. So essentially it's going to let me bring more things out. And there's 16 of these different cards at the start of the game that are randomized, available for your choice. Perhaps I decide that I like the ship card, and I decide to pay my 1 gold in order to add that to my discard, completing my 2 actions. Now that I have 1 remaining card in my hand, I must keep this in my hand because discarding cards is an action that I did not take, and I've already spent my 2 actions. So I would draw up my hand, drawing 4 more cards until I had 5 in hand in order to prepare for my next turn. And we'd see what I have. I have some armies and a bunch of provinces with food, armies, brick, and some more food. And I would start looking at these in order to see what I can do on my next turn. Now that I am done with my turn, I would pass the play to the next player, and as I said, continue figuring out what I want to do on my next turn. And the next player would, of course, have their hand of 5 cards. Now, I'm not going to use specific examples for each thing because I don't know what each player is going to draw each time, but you'll see that they have very similar cards. They have their own provinces, and then they drew a ship card. So let's talk about several of the different actions. Let's talk about placing ships. If I wanted to place a ship, I would discard cards that have the ship symbol, and I would be able to place 1 ship for each ship symbol that I play in a province adjacent, or in the water adjacent to where I have a province. So for this player, it could be from Scrombroid here. I could play my 1 ship by discarding it or playing it to my play area. And that would allow me to put a ship out into the water. This ship will provide support to all of the adjacent provinces in attack and defense. So it's a way to kind of boost your attack or defense for various areas by not even having armies there, but just supporting them generally with ships. That is placing ships. Another action could be to remove ships. You can simply pull them off of the board, and that takes an action to return them to your supply. You may do this because you have a limited number of ship tokens that you can use unless you buy more from your generic supply, not your currently active supply, but a generic supply of tokens that you have off to the side that you may purchase to get more armies or more ships. So let's talk about that action. You may buy more armies or more ships for an action. Buying them will cost money from cards, so I could spend a card or money, and I could spend multiple money if I had it, in order to buy ships and armies. You start with 6 armies and 2 ships, but if I wanted to buy more, it costs me 1 per army I'd like to buy from my generic supply, and 2 per ship that I would like to buy so that I can place them out onto the board later. You can also, of course, place armies out onto the board. To place armies onto the board, you're going to spend cards that have the little army symbol. For each army symbol you spend, you may place armies out into a province you already control. So if I wanted to spend these 3, I could place 3 of my army tokens out into a province where I'm already present. This can also be done in the form of an invasion action, and invasion actions are much more complex. The first thing you need for an invasion action is the province you want to start from. So if I want to start from Remiss, which is right here, I would have to play the Remiss card. I can then play a food card if I were to have one, which I do. I can play my ship card as a food. That will allow me to march my armies, paying the food to move them along, into an adjacent province. When I get to that province, I will have to play armies. So, for example, I could pay my 3 armies in order to place my 3 units out into Eager here. And that will start a war in that area. Currently, the defense of this area is very low. We don't really have to worry about it because there's no terrain and there's no fighting armies. However, you can't end a combat, which is an action, end a war, until your next turn, and it must always be your first action on the turn. So, my opponent will have the opportunity to shore up their defenses here by placing more units, and then at the start of my turn, if I'm not clearly winning, I can't end the war. You can only end a war if there's a clear winner, but when you do so, you will take that province over if you're the attacker and you're winning, removing your opponent's town, placing a town of your own, and swapping victory points with them, where they will lose 3 victory points for losing a province, and you would gain 3. The player would also remove the province card from their deck for losing that village or that town and give it to you to add to your deck. More so, you would also get a victory point for the Spoils of War for taking over an area belonging to an opponent, or if they successfully defended and ended the war on their turn by being the victor, they would receive a victory point for being the defender of the realm. So that is invading. You must have the location you're starting from, food to pay your troops, and the troops you need to move into a location. There are several more actions you can take. For example, removing armies from a province. You're always allowed to pull your armies back off of the board as an action from one province where you control it, meaning that you have a town, city, or castle, and your opponent isn't currently there waging a war on you. Furthermore, you can do things like discarding cards. We already talked about that a little bit, but if you have cards in your hand that you simply can't or don't want to use, you may take an action to discard as many cards from your hand as you like in order to be able to draw up in the next turn up to your 5 cards. You may also remove cards from your deck or hand permanently, and it's an action to remove 1 or 2 cards from your deck permanently, setting them off to the side so that you no longer draw them. This could be province cards for provinces that you still hold, or it could be your starting action cards. It could even be improvement cards that you've drafted throughout the game that you no longer have a use for, and even if you remove them, you can still buy them back with the draft cards action that we discussed earlier for 1 gold apiece. You can reserve cards for future rounds. Reserving is limited to the number of cities you have, so currently you'll see that I can reserve 2 cards, placing cards from my hand into reserve in order to use them on a future turn. This, as I said, is an action, so you simply set them to the side in order to be able to use them in your future hand. The only way to get rid of them is to play them, or to use the discard action to remove them and put them into your discard pile. There are other actions that can theoretically come up throughout the game. For example, there's a victory point card that adds an action. By spending 2 money, you can earn some victory points. Or certain cards will have actions on them when you have them in your hand. So for example, the Marauders have a free action, but various cards in here will have actions that you may use. For example, pay 1 gold in order to stop a war with the Diplomat. Those cards require actions to use as well. The final action we need to discuss is the ability to end the game, which is an action and must be the first action you perform on your turn, much like ending a war. In order to end the game, you must be the clear victor of the game, and it must be your first action without taking any free actions at the start of your turn. When you end the game, you will end all current wars, calculating who's the victor of the war. So if there's a conflict going on in an area, it ends immediately, with ties going to the defender. You will adjust the victory points appropriately, gaining victory points if you manage to take over a territory, or losing victory points if you manage to lose one. And of course, readjust to see who's the victor. You may only end the game if you will win, so in the scenario, you'll calculate, see if the action is legal, and if not, continue on with the game. Otherwise, if you're a clear winner after resolving all of the wars and calculating out the appropriate victory points, you will win. However, this action can only be done if at least 4 of these victory point areas are empty over here. So 4 of these must be done, all of the tokens removed, then you may declare the end of the game, and if you're a clear winner, you'll be the person who has conquered Mythotopia. And there you have it. That is Mythotopia from Tree Frog Games and Martin Wallace. This game is one that I enjoy quite a bit. I've been a fan of the card-driven, semi-deck building, map-based game for a while, ever since A Few Acres of Snow came out. And I managed to avoid the whole controversy of the Halifax Hammer and not ever play that strategy. And I really enjoyed it, but it was limited to playing a 2-player game. And I think that's kind of where this expands upon that experience and will replace A Few Acres of Snow in my game catalog. I'm not going to keep A Few Acres of Snow because I feel that this gives me the same experience but can accommodate more players. This somewhat combines to me the feeling of A Few Acres of Snow and Ankh-Morpork, which I mentioned earlier, in which you're trying to hold various territories, which of course is true in both A Few Acres of Snow and Ankh-Morpork. But the feeling of the game, I feel, is just a little more streamlined than what A Few Acres of Snow reminded me of, although they're very, very similar. Overall, though, you have a little bit more positioning to take over neutral territories. You have a little bit more positioning in terms of attacking other players directly because there are more players involved. But yes, it does have a very similar feel. If you like to incorporate more players, I think you're going to enjoy this. Also, the variable victory point conditions, the different ways to earn victory points, be it from building buildings or conquering other things or exploring the sea or preventing your own territories from being taken over or working with dragons, whatever it might be, add a nice flavor to the game. So I do enjoy that. The game is still very fiddly. You're working with several cards and there are a lot of things to remember. When you're invading somebody, you need to have the starting province and ship cards if you want to go oversea, and food and enough military tokens, and then when you want to end a war you have to do the calculation. And it's not intensive math, but there's a good amount of math and a good amount of fiddliness in moving things around and making sure you have the right cards. And very frequently you will find yourself going, wait a minute, what cards did I need in order to do this action? It's just something that will happen, and you'll have to go through the reference card or play multiple times before you remember those things. So combined together, the fact that I enjoy the gameplay, I like all of the options that are available, I like the fact that there's many, many things I can do with my cards and that I need to balance them appropriately, but combining that with the fiddliness, I'd put this kind of in the middle range of enjoyable for me. Despite that, it's a game that I do like playing. It's one that I will bring out from time to time, especially with players who have played it before, because it does have that nice depth to it and the interactivity. So if that sounds good to you, I would definitely suggest checking it out, especially if you're a fan of A Few Acres of Snow or these card-driven games. That's Mythotopia from Tree Frog.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.